Hello and welcome to the Mormon Yeshiva. Today's episode is episode 9 in our Beholding Eternity series. This one is entitled, excuse me, Climbing the Ladder to Heaven. Again, please make note of our fair use disclaimer. This is just for educational purposes, and I hope that you will take it in the spirit in which it is meant. This particular portion has to do with Helaman chapter 6. As we read the Book of Mormon, we read over a lot of story that appears at first glance to just be a part of the narrative, just details such as, they went north, they went south, they had a war here, they had a war there, so-and-so killed so-and-so. And what appears to be a narrative in one way actually contains very ancient Israelite symbols, which are meant to communicate knowledge on a much deeper level. Helaman 6 is one such an occasion where this type of teaching occurs. In the prior episodes, we talked about the meditative practices that are couched in the book of Helaman, such as calling upon the name, as well as the fire meditation. And these, how they were related to a change in our state of spirit or consciousness. And once we have entered into that way, once we have actually, gotten to that point where we have understood those practices that are related to, our hearts and minds and emotions bonding with God, the question is, how then do we progress? Well, Helaman chapter 6 is just such an example. So let's begin by first examining this portion. Helaman chapter 6, let's start at verse 8. And it came to pass that the Lamanites did also go whithersoever they would, whether among the Lamanites or among the Nephites. And thus they did have free intercourse one with another, to buy and to sell, and to get gain, according to their desire. Okay, so that word desire, kavanah in Hebrew, desire, is a very important term. And it's going to play into the instruction that Helaman chapter 6 gives us. In other words, everything here, as we progress up this path of progression, has to do with our desire. And it came to pass that they became exceedingly rich, both the Lamanites and the Nephites, and they did have an exceeding plenty of gold and of silver and of all manner of precious metals, both in the land south and in the land north. Now again, that's really interesting because again, gold, silver, and precious metals have symbolic meanings in Israel. Gold, things of the celestial world; silver, things of the world of creation; other precious metals like bronze or brass being related to that which is angelic. The land north, okay, being the upper world; the land south being this world. And now the land south was called Lehi, and the land north was called Mulek, which is interesting because Lehi, again, while one of its meanings is a jawbone of an ass, the other meanings is that it is a play on words in the sense of like the land of, Lehi, or the land of the living, like the living soul that we've talked about in other episodes, the land of living souls. And whereas Mulek, play off on words, meaning in one aspect young prince, in another aspect the idea of connected to Melech, or the things of the king, the things of the throne, the upper worlds, which was after the son of Zedekiah. And the Lord did bring Mulek into the land north, a place of power, and Lehi into the land south. And behold, there was all manner of gold in both these lands, and of silver, and of precious ore of every kind. And there were also curious workmen. Pay attention to that. See that word, curious workmen, curious workmanship. These are temple-related teachings, okay, who did work all kinds of ore and did refine it, and thus they did become rich. They did raise grain in abundance, both in the north and in the south, and they did flourish exceedingly, both in the north and in the south. And they did multiply and wax exceedingly strong in the land. And they did raise many flocks and herds, yes, and many fatlings. Behold, their women did toil and spin, and did make all manner of cloth, of fine twined linen. That's a very important symbol. and cloth of every kind, to clothe their nakedness, and thus the 60th year did pass away in peace. And in the 65th year they did also have great joy and peace. Yes, much preaching and many prophecies concerning that which was to come. And thus passed away the 65th year. So, in discussing this section of Helaman 6, it's actually related to a much more ancient doctrine. And these things have counterparts in the Torah and in the prophets. But one of them is, of course, the 7 blessings, sometimes which are equated with the 7 women. So astronomically, we will see counterparts throughout scriptures. For example, the 7 women are the Pleiades, 7 churches in Revelation, the 7 churches of the land of Zarahemla, as well as their relationship to, of all things, the constellation Taurus, which in that era was considered the mountain of the Lord's house. In other words, the house of El, or in other words, like Aleph being a bull, Taurus is a bull, and of course, the constellations also being symbols for mountains. In this ancient teaching of the 7 blessings, or the 7 women, or the 7 sisters, or the 7 prophetesses, because they go by many names, we find a teaching related to the 7 double letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The 7 double letters of the Hebrew alphabet are comprised of Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pe, Resh, and Tav. These 7 letters symbolize, on the positive side, or the female side, wisdom, wealth, seed, life, dominance, peace, and grace. There is also a negative side. We'll go into that later. I'd like to focus on the positive first. These are the concepts that could be controlled through the 7 double letters. In other words, these 7 qualities parallel the 7 vertical lines in a tree of life diagram. They also relate to the 7 times that the phrase "it was good" occurs in the account of creation. They also are related to the idea of the 7 themes of Isaiah, which comprise the ladder of heaven. One of the best, hands down, commentaries on Isaiah is, I find, Isaiah Decoded, Ascending the Ladder to Heaven by Avraham Gileadi, wherein he basically displays these same 7 concepts. He enumerates them using different words, but the baseline concepts are basically the same. For example, the first rung of the ladder, ruin and rebirth. So you have a negative aspect, ruin, and a positive aspect, rebirth. Just like the double letters have a harsh sound, the male sound, the negative, or the soft sound, which is the feminine, and the positive. Okay, so these types of themes of 7 run in doubles. So ruin, like as he enumerates here in his ladder of heaven and the overall structure of Isaiah Decoded, he talks about, rung 1, ruin and rebirth, rebellion and compliance, punishment and deliverance, humiliation and exaltation, suffering and salvation, disloyalty and loyalty, disinheritance and inheritance. In other words, as Avram Gileadi points out in his book, which I, like I said, very much enjoy and very much recommend that if you want an in-depth study of Isaiah, that you really explore his works, because bar none, they are among the best. But either way, in our study here today, we're going to focus on those positive concepts instead of just the negative, because in our Helaman aspect, the idea is we're going to progress up this ladder from rebirth all the way to inheritance, which is a progression up the ladder of, say, the 7 double letters in the Hebrew language, what they represent. This is why your Gadiant robbers, you'll also find as you go through Helaman, they're being related to the negative aspects, the downward spiral of the ladder, if you will. So the Gadiant robbers and their behavior brings about ruin, rebellion, punishment, humiliation, suffering, disloyalty, and disinheritance. While those who are faithful ascend up the ladder of rebirth, compliance, deliverance, exaltation, salvation, loyalty, and inheritance. So amazingly, this particular concept of the seven double letters, the seven blessings, the seven women, the seven rungs of the ladder, are actually couched throughout Scripture. And specifically in Helaman, in regard to meditation, it's the idea of bonding with God, both in our spirits, our hearts, our minds, and our thoughts, our emotions, to ascend this ladder. But we have to know, to ascend, we have to know what the rungs are. What is the pathway? In ancient world, sometimes this is called the pathway of Sheen or the pathway of fire. So this all relates to the 7 steps of Jacob's ladder. We're going to be ascending today. We're going to talk about ascending today. So what is Jacob's ladder all about? Well, as we discussed earlier, these 7 themes of Isaiah, we'll stick with the positive. Okay, so rebirth is equal to wisdom. Compliance, wealth. Deliverance equals seed. Exaltation should be life, or instead of live, should be life. Salvation, dominance or dominion. Loyalty, peace. Inheritance is equivocated to grace, or the 7 double letters, the positive aspects. So this is also where we get the idea of the 7 blessings and the 7 women in Revelation 1. Okay, and here, notice this, the mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. Now, interestingly enough, the 7 stars are the Pleiades. Okay, the 7 golden candlesticks is also there was the throne of God, and one walked before the throne in the midst of these 7 golden candlesticks as described in the book of Revelation. So he's also not only giving us physical symbols here below, but also even equating it to astronomical symbols so that we can see how they're connecting the two from, say, a Jerusalem here on earth, a type and shadow here of what exists up in the heavenly Jerusalem that we look up in the skies every day and see, or should I say every night and see, because in a sense that is the heavenly Jerusalem, and there is a temple of heaven above, just as there is a temple of heaven here, or a tabernacle, whose pattern is after that of a cosmological nature. And notice it says here, like an Alma, and now there were 7 churches in the land of Zarahemla. And it came to pass that whosoever were desirous to take upon them the name of Christ or of God, they did join the churches of God. And they were called the people of God. And the Lord did pour out his Spirit upon them, and they were blessed and prospered in the land. So in other words, even the land of Zarahemla is being used in the Book of Mormon very similar to the symbol of Jerusalem in Israel, in the sense that Zarahemla, you have a Zarahemla below, and then you have a Zarahemla above, like an astronomical picture or a cosmological picture, if you will. And the idea being that as you look above, you can see the symbols there, pattern of heaven and on earth. And these churches, or really assemblies of people, these are the people who were ascending up that ladder, and what allowed them for the Lord to pour out his Spirit upon them, and which made them blessed or prospered in the land. So let's take a look at where these things come from. First, of course, is Helaman 6, is the attribute of wisdom. And it came to pass that the Lamanites did go whithersoever they would, whether it were among the Lamanites or among the Nephites. And thus they did have free intercourse one with another, to buy and to sell, and to get gain according to their desires. Okay, now here's the thing. To buy and to sell is actually a symbolic expression in Hebrew for the acquisition of wisdom. Now, wisdom in Hebrew is not just the correct application of knowledge, although certainly that is wise, but it's the idea of wisdom is the idea of obtaining the life of God, the Spirit of God. It is his direct intelligence. It's everything that goes, it's not just one idea. It's a multitude of ideas, but the closest we would say, imagine the essence of God is wisdom. But they did gain this wisdom according to their desire. Now, again, free intercourse one with another, to buy and to sell and to get gain according to their desire, equals wisdom. Where do we find this? Well, we see concepts like this shown, for example, throughout both, the writings of the prophets. For example, Proverbs 23:23, buy the truth and sell it not. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. Again, buy and sell. The concept of buy and selling being related to wisdom. Okay, in Isaiah 55:1, ho, everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters. He that hath no money, come ye, buy and eat. Yes, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. It's the idea of wine and milk are related to the concepts of wisdom as well. So we're buying this, or we're exchanging this. And again, and that no man might buy or sell. We also see this in Revelation, where a lot of people see this as, this is a, Mark of the Beast kind of thing. There's also a hidden teaching there in relation to buying and selling, and its relationship is wisdom. For example, notice the parallelism, and that no man might buy or sell, save he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Notice what he says. Here is wisdom. Well, here's wisdom parallels buying or selling. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for his number of a man, and his number is 666. I'll probably cover this in another series that I'm working on right now for the book of Revelation from a Hebraic standpoint. But for now, we begin to see that when you see the phraseology buy or sell, it's also a symbolic expression for the concept of wisdom being exchanged. It sounds strange in our culture, in American culture, but in ancient Israelite culture, it was something that was actually very common. So when it came to pass, so in Helaman 6, the next one, of course, the next letter that we're going to after BETH is, of course, is GIMEL. GIMEL is the second of the double letters and equivocates to what we call wealth. But the question is, what kind of wealth? Well, here we go. And it came to pass that they became exceedingly rich, both the Lamanites and the Nephites, and they did have an exceeding plenty of gold and of silver and of all manner of precious metals, both in the land south and in the land north. Okay, notice the wealth here. Gold and of silver and of all manner of precious metals, both in the land south and in the land north. Okay, first off, let's kind of give this a different phraseology here. So, for example, gold are the teachings and those things which pertain to the throne of heaven. Silver would be like your creative world, your Edenic world. Okay, and all manner of precious metals, such as brass or bronze, being related to, say, the teachings of angels. This is why, it talks about the brass plates and how the brass plates were given to Joseph Smith by an angel. It actually makes a lot of sense because in the Israelite mindset, brass or bronze is related to angelic beings. So that an angel gives Joseph Smith a set of brass plates, or leads him to obtain them, makes consistent sense with Israelite theology. So what they're saying here is that they're obtaining the wisdom that they obtain, then they also obtain through wisdom, or the life of God, the essence of God that comes into them. They begin to search and obtain what? Gold and silver, the teachings of the upper world, the teachings of creation, the teachings of the angels, both in the land south, here in the world of the living, as it is in the land north, or the upper worlds, as above, so below, or as we replicate here below, that which is above. In other words, the two come into conformance one with another. Or another way of saying it, have you received the image of God in your countenance? Do you pattern yourself and your world around you after that which is in heaven above? We're becoming a literal image of the Son of God. Now notice what he says. Now the land south was called Lehi, the land north was called Melech, which is after the son of Zedekiah. For the Lord did bring Melech into the land north, and Lehi into the land south. And behold, there was all manner of gold in both these lands, and silver, and a precious ore of every kind. And there were also curious workmen. If you look in the Torah under, and I believe this is in Exodus, it might be Deuteronomy, but it says Bezalel. He is one of the curious workmen with whom God infused with wisdom. Okay, that's a pattern for us. God infused him with wisdom to create this particular prophet in the Torah, this workman, to create the implements of the tabernacle of Moses, all of its precious gold instruments like the menorah and much of its furniture. Okay, and who did work all kinds of ore and refine it, and thus they did become rich. Now here's our next one, Dalet. Okay, Helaman, Dalet, seed. Okay, they did raise grain in abundance, or in other words, seed, both in the north and in the south. Now again, they did raise grain in abundance, both the north and the south. There's your principle of seed. The enumerated sacred grains this is actually related to the enumerated sacred grains found in the book of Deuteronomy. It's the idea of the grains and fruits that were to be made that can be used as offerings and is acceptable for holy offerings in that particular thing, Deuteronomy 8. It's also related to the idea of what we call the path of Sheen, or the path of fire, which is interesting, the pathway of fire or purification. What's interesting about this is, again, they raised grain both in the north and the south. In other words, not only did they create and obtain the fruits of the upper world, they also brought it and made manifest here in this lower world, so that which was above could be manifest here, and that which is below, heaven and earth connecting and becoming one. In other words, what true priesthood was meant to do, which is to transform the earth around us and our homes, our families, our communities, our nations, into a pattern of heaven, and to bring, to return the earth from its fallen condition back to its exalted position before the fall. So let's take a look at some of these, quote, seeds. Now, it is, as I said, these idea of what is produced is connected to the concept of the 7 set apart species found in Deuteronomy 8:8. So, for example, it talks in Deuteronomy 8:8, it talks about a land of wheat and barley and vines or grapes, okay, and fig trees and pomegranates, and a land of olive oil and honey. Now, the honey is listed as something sweet. We would think of it in our concept as honey. There are those who also say that that is date juice, and that's a possibility, knowing that the whole land over there, a land of milk and honey, is also a land of milk and date juice. But again, depends on who you talk to. I like to see the idea of honey because it's related to a honeybee. But the scriptures, tend to talk about honeycombs related to the word that they use for honey. Anyway, but here are the 7 species of fruits and of basically fruits and grains, all of which were considered seed or grain of some type. Wheat, barley, vines, again grapes, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. So there's an entire teaching that we could go into. We really don't have the time to do that here regarding these 7 species and how they relate to the temple, as well as to ascending the ladder at this point. But just know that they're there right now, and that they are related to other things in the production of the fruits of the of the tree of life, specifically the lower 7 fruits of the tree of life, which make up sometimes what we call the lower 7 sephirot. Sometimes they go by different, in the Merkava mysticism. They are the fruits and seeds of the vessel, which is interesting because you'll see First Nephi, which is very interestingly related to the idea of some of the teachings of the ancient Merkava mystics of Israel. And it came to pass, this is First Nephi 18:6, and it came to pass on the morrow, after we had prepared all things, much fruits and meat. Now, meat is not necessarily It's an Old English term. It could mean just food, like vegetables, seeds of any kind, from the wilderness, and honey in abundance and provisions, according to that which the Lord had commanded us. And we did go down into the ship with all our loading and our seeds, and whatsoever things we had brought with us, every one according to his age. Wherefore we did go down into the ship with our wives and our children. And where did they go? To the land of promise. What is the purpose of ascent? Okay, to return from a fallen state to a condition that is not fallen, which could be symbolized by the land of promise, or a place that is back into the presence of God, or condition. So the next rung is on Helaman 6 is Kaf, lettered by the letter Kaf, which symbolizes the life. And here we see in verse 12, and they did flourish exceedingly both in the north and in the south. The idea of they did flourish exceedingly both in the north and the south also has to do with establishing of life, flourishing, living. Okay. The next letter we see is symbolized Pe, or dominance. Okay, or dominion is another way of saying it. We would see in verse 12, and they did multiply and wax exceedingly strong in the land. And they did raise many flocks and herds, yes, many fatlings. Okay, and they did multiply and wax exceedingly strong in the land as dominance or dominion. It actually comes and is related to the idea of what we see in Genesis, where God says to man, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And God said, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. Like I said, let them have dominion. That's the idea in Genesis 1, 26 through 28, is that, he created them in his own image, male and female. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and the sea, and over the fowls of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. This is, as you go through a lot of these concepts, if you'll notice carefully, especially in the idea of ascent, you will see a lot of the symbols of Genesis 1 used in Helaman, especially in regard to the ascension of the ladder of heaven. In other words, from the very get-go, when God says from the 7 days of creation, and each where he says, of those, it is good, the 7 times he says it is good, those are related to the rungs of Jacob's ladder. They're related to the 7 double letters. So in that aspect, notice that all roads lead to Genesis. Well, in this sense, yes, from the very beginning, God gave us a pattern of ascent and descent. So Helaman 6, RESH, it's the idea of peace. Behold, their women did toil and spin, and to make all manner of cloth of fine twined linen, and cloth of every kind to clothe their nakedness. And the 64th year to pass away in peace. And thus the 64th year to pass away in peace, i.e., shalom, peace. So there's another rung of the ladder. But the idea also is connected to the idea of making fine twined linen. The symbol of fine twined linen in the ancient Israelite is connected to the high priest clothing and the priest clothing in the tabernacle. It is an outward expression, in a sense, of our spiritual bodies, our bodies of light, whatever you want to call them, our garments of light that were, fell, and God gave us garments of skins. But the idea being that we have a light body, a spirit, okay? And our spirits, they want to ascend to this condition of peace. But peace in Hebrew doesn't necessarily mean like just an absence of conflict. The idea of peace, or shalom, is a condition or state of being, and that it's an idea of covenant oneness with God, where our hearts are bound to Him. In other words, we've reached that point where our hearts are bound to Him. They're one with Him. They reflect Him. They are like Him. And, as God is in our hearts, so are we. We're like Nephi in the book of Helaman. God gives him the sealing power, if you will, because he knows he will not ask amiss. Well, that's the same concept. Our hearts are in that condition of oneness with him. And when we reach that point, that which we ask will always be granted because our hearts are so bound to him. It's as if it's the same heart, the same desire, the same mind, the same thoughts, mind, hearts and thoughts, emotions, and will, if you will. Helaman 6, tav, or grace. Now, this is an interesting one because how they express it here. And in the 65th year, they did also have great joy and peace, which is actually a definition of grace in Hebrew is a condition of joy and peace. Yes, much preaching and many prophecies concerning that which was to come, and thus passed away the 65th year. So they did have great joy and peace. Yes, much preaching and many prophecies. Now remember, prophecies in Hebrew, even though there are prophecies of that which is to come, the idea of the prophetic in Hebrew, remember there's a prophetic past, a prophetic present, and a prophetic future. But prophecy in general is the idea of reminding or bringing back to our remembrance or reestablishing that which was ancient in the now, or telling us that which was ancient will come back in the future. So this isn't anything new. It's the idea of what has been, shall be, okay, that Avraham Gileadi talks about. It's a concept of prophecy is the idea of bringing things to remembrance of what was once ancient in that golden era, if you will, before the fall. And then, of course, we go through restorations. We've gone through reestablishments of the house of Israel, various covenant houses, and why? The idea is to reestablish the ancient order of things. So these 7 blessings are what we call the 7 women, or the 7 prophetesses, okay? And they are the double letters BETH, GIMEL, DALETH, KAF, PE, RESH, and TAV. Their foundation is what? What do they symbolize? Wisdom, wealth, seed, life, dominance, peace, and grace. And what do those relate to? Well, those are the actual rungs of Jacob's ladder. That's the path of progression. This is why I also think that Nephi chose the specific chapters of Isaiah that appear in 2nd Nephi, because each of those chapters is a portion or demonstrates a part of each of these 7 rungs. So it's always been my contention that one of the reasons why the words of Isaiah are so great is not only is it gives us a pattern of prophetic things to come, it also gives us the blueprint of the ancient order of things that we are meant to establish as we ascend up that Jacob's ladder, up that ladder of ascension, up the 7 positive aspects of the double letters. And this is where we get to the concept in Isaiah 4. So this is something I've had a lot of people come at me about this. For some reason, it's interesting, and I understand why they do it, is they think that this is an actual scripture on saying that gives them approval to everybody to live polygamy. However, from the Israelite prophetic, the idea of the 7 women in Isaiah 4 has really nothing to do with polygamy per se, but it does have to do with the enjoining or the ascension of up the 7 rungs until we are bonded or join ourselves to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And notice what it says. In that day, 7 women, the Pleiades, the 7 rungs, the 7 aspects, positive aspects of the ladder, shall take hold of one man. In other words, in chapter 3 of Isaiah, it actually enumerates the 7 negative aspects. But in chapter 4, it begins to tell you to take hold of the 7 positive aspects. So instead of death, you're going through a rebirth. That which was once dead will come through a rebirth. We want to be reborn. What does it take to be reborn? Wisdom, life from God. Okay, in that day the 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread, we will wear our own apparel, only let us be called by thy name to take our way, our approach. Now notice the parallelism. And in that day shall the branch of the Lord, okay, the 7 women equate to, in a sense, connecting to the branch. Who is the one man? The Lord, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah. Be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent. and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. In other words, there will be those who come forth out of Israel, and they will bind themselves, they will ascend the ladder, they will bind themselves to Jehovah, okay, God. And as they do, they become that beautiful branch, if you will. And it came to pass that he that is left in Zion, and he that remaineth in Jerusalem, shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem. So instead of seeing this just as some type of approbation, or I don't know what to call it, a teaching that says everybody's got to live polygamy, which I still have yet to see that anywhere. It's the idea that this is actually a more important scripture of those 7 women, those 7 negative attributes and positive attributes, or rungs of the ladder. We want to be the positive attributes. We want to ascend the positive aspects of the 7 letters, or the ascent up the tree of the ladder of heaven. We have to bind ourselves to God, and in binding ourselves to God, those women become a beautiful branch, and symbolizing that all those who are left in Zion, in other words, all those who do this, all those who ascend this path, ascend this ladder in the positive aspects, become a Zion. They should be called holy. All those that remain in Jerusalem, they'll be called holy. In other words, the idea being, as we do this, as we ascend, we become that Zion. We become that monument. We become that landmark. And it shall be set apart, or holy, or kadosh. And so the idea is, instead of seeing this as a chapter on polygamy, look at this as the idea of, I'm going to ascend this ladder of bonding with God. And as I do it, true beauty, shall be beautiful. Tiferet, the heart of the tree of life, the secret of Messiah is manifest here on earth. And notice this interesting. What are the aspects of a worthy woman? Here's the idea of a divine feminine. And this is where, men and women need to really appreciate the divine feminine. And we can't go on time in this particular episode to go into the full aspect of the divine feminine. But in Proverbs 31, it gives you a template, if you will, or a picture of what is a virtuous woman, or what is a worthy woman. Okay, and it's not a commentary on women today saying, okay, you should all, fit this picture. It's the idea of, well, they should fit this picture. So should the men, in the sense that we are all a bride, and we want to be a worthy, receiver from God. We want to receive, to bestow life. Just as a woman receives seed from her husband and brings forth life, the same thing is that we collectively, as a spiritual bride, receive life from God and bring forth fruits, or a kingdom, if you will. So it says, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. Rubies is one of the symbols also for a wisdom teaching. And the heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. And she seeks wool and flax, fine twined linen, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. You can go on and read this. It's a beautiful chapter describing the divine feminine, describing what our condition as all believers, both male and female, should be, in that, we want to be receivers, but also what the element or the spirit of that wisdom, or chokmah in Hebrew, symbolizes, that it breathes life into us, and what it brings forth in us and from us to the world. Now, there are, just as there are 7 positive steps, or rungs of the ladder of ascent, there are negatives. And this, in actuality, in Helaman, is what you will see over and over again connected with the Gadianton robbers. Just like you have the Nephites and the Lamanites who were working in righteousness bring forth the positive aspects, the Gadianton robbers bring forth the negative aspects. And in chapters 7, and from 6 to 7, at the end of it and into 7, the negatives are enumerated by the Gadianton robbers. So go in there and read that, but I'll at least show you the idea of the opposite. So the opposite of wisdom is folly or foolishness. Okay, the opposite of wealth is poverty. The opposite of seed is desolation. The opposite of life is death. The opposite of dominion or dominance is subjugation. The opposite of peace is war. And the opposite of grace is just downright ugliness. In other words, it doesn't end well. But the idea is that you're going down, 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 down on a negative aspect. So your Gadiant and robbers, in many ways, are related to the seven negatives of the ladder, whereas those faithful Nephites and Lehites who had intercourse one with another and bought and sold and brought forth all these fruits, okay, these good fruits, those that shows you the polar opposites, the positive versus the negative. Positive, those Nephites and the Lamanites who obtained the good, ascended the ladder, obtained the good fruits, if you will, versus the Gadiant and robbers who had to basically obtain everything through murder, theft, and just about every crime under the sun. Now, lest you think this is an isolated instance in the Book of Mormon, you will also see this pattern and this same progression in the Book of Ether, the 7 steps of Jacob ladder. Notice how it's enumerated here, almost the same exact words. And they were exceedingly industrious, this means the Jaredites. And they did buy and sell and traffic, buy and sell wisdom, one with another that they might get gain. And they did work in all manner of ore, and they did make gold and silver, iron and brass, and all manner of metals. In other words, there's your wealth. And they did dig it out of the earth, wherefore they did cast up mighty heaps of earth to get ore of gold and of silver and of iron and of copper and of all manner of fine work. Okay, fine or curious. Okay, and they did have silks and fine twined linen. They did work in all manner of cloth, and they might clothe themselves from their nakedness. Notice the similarities between that and Helaman 6. They did make all manner of tools to till the earth, both to plow and to sow and to reap and to hoe and also to thrash. There's your idea of seed. They did make all manner of tools that they did work with beasts, dominion over the beasts. They did make all manner of weapons of war, dominance, and they did also work all manner of work of exceedingly curious workmanship. Again, notice that prophetic marker, curious workmanship. And never could there be a people more blessed than they, and were prospered by the hand of the Lord. And they were in a land that was choice above all other lands, for the Lord had spoken it. And it came to pass that Lev did live in many years and beget sons and daughters, and he also beget Hartum. Okay, those names, by the way, mean something. Give you one of them, Lev. Also, Lev meaning the heart. So, in other words, these teachings are interconnected. They're intertwined. There is something as we look at Helaman, we're being given disciplines of bonding with God. We can sometimes call them meditative disciplines, but the idea of taking time to bond with God in both our thoughts, our emotions, and our desires. And we obtain wisdom in the land northward and southward, above and below, according to our desires. We obtain, heavenly teachings, those things that pertain to the heavens, God's throne, symbolized by gold and silver, that which is Eden, or brass, that which is of angels. These are things that we, obtain in our ascent, those teachings and those instructions from heaven. We in a sense, wisdom brings forth fine-twined linen. In other words, our spirits begin to awaken. Our spiritual bodies begin to awaken. And then we become clothed with light rather than just clothed with garments of skin. We now become clothed with garments of light, which is what's symbolized by the priest's garment in the tabernacle of Moses and also in the temples. The idea of bringing forth seed, the different seeds, wheat, and barley, and the things that they represent. Then having righteous dominion upon the earth over the beasts, not just only the beasts of the field, but over the kingdoms of the earth. Beasts and kingdoms being a symbol one for the other. Making all manner of weapons of war. Okay, notice the weapons of war. While that is an aspect of dominion, God's weapons of war are a little bit different. They're also holy words. In other words, they are when Christ in the book of Revelation, a sword comes out of his mouth. is connected to the idea of the language of angels and establishing, like what we see Enoch in the pearl of great price, as he spoke, and the nation stood afar off. Okay, they did, and they did all manner of exceedingly curious workmanship. So these are they worked in the things of heaven, of the upper worlds here on earth, and they would never be a more blessed people than they were. In other words, they're being, they're becoming a Zion society, and they were in a land that was choice above all other lands. They achieved a state of, to be blessed and prospered is a state of peace and grace. And it came to pass that this Lev, where did it start? In the heart. And and then I would suggest you look up Hartom. It's quite an interesting meaning. And if not, we can go. I have an article on Mormon Yeshiva where it talks about Hartom in this meaning. So this is a long one today. I hope you've enjoyed this. Next time we will commence talking about Nephi up on the tower in the book of Helaman. But excuse me, I think this is part 9. I don't know why I have part 8 there, but this is part 9 in the Ascending the Ladder. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.